It began on a night so still that even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. The air was damp, heavy with the metallic tang of an approaching storm, but no thunder came. In the valley outside Madison County, Georgia, where pines crowded close like tall, whispering sentries, the silence was wrong, unnatural. Just past midnight, the first scream rang out. It was not the short, sharp cry of a startled animal, nor the shout of a man in trouble. This sound was long, unbroken, raw, as though a human throat had been forced open and left to pour terror into the night. Then came another, overlapping, and then a third. Before long, it was no longer one scream, but many. A chorus, echoing through the trees until the woods themselves seemed to wail. Neighbors on distant farms bolted upright in their beds. Dogs barked and then went quiet, ears flat, tails tucked. Some men grabbed their rifles and stepped onto their porches, straining to locate the sound, but the screams seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the darkened hills. For hours they went on. By lantern light, a handful of farmers gathered at the edge of the dirt road, their faces pale, whispering that the sound was coming from the Marrow homestead, a lonely cabin at the farthest edge of the settlement. The Marrows kept to themselves, but they were known to be good, God-fearing folk. Nothing about them hinted at the kind of madness that could produce what was happening now. And yet, not one man dared go to the cabin before sunrise. Fear pinned them in place, as if the night itself was holding them hostage. Each time the screaming swelled, they swore the trees seemed to shake, though no wind stirred. The moon was a thin red sliver in the sky, casting just enough light to show their breath in the cold air. In September, when the nights were not supposed to be this cold. Then, as suddenly as it had begged, the sound stopped. The men stood there for several minutes, listening to the dead quiet. Even the owls and frogs had gone mute. Something was wrong, horribly wrong. But no one spoke. At last, one man spat into the dirt and said what they were all thinking. "We'll go at first light, if there's anything left to find." At first light, the men saddled their horses in silence, riding single file down the rutted road toward the edge of the settlement. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin, and a pale mist clung low to the ground, curling around the hooves of their animals like smoke. No one spoke. Every creak of saddle leather seemed louder than it should have been. The Marrow homestead was the last farm before the wild forest took over. Elias Marrow had chosen that patch of land himself, years before, clearing it with his own hands and building the cabin from felled pine. Folks respected him. He was a quiet man, deliberate in his words, strong in his faith. But even before the last harvest, people had started to notice a change. Elias stopped attending Sunday service, claiming the walk was too far, though he had made it for years. Temperance Marrow, usually seen chatting with other women at market, became withdrawn, her face pale, her eyes shadowed. The children, 2 boys and a girl, no longer played with neighbor kids. Instead, they kept to the cabin, appearing only at dawn to fetch water and wood, staring straight ahead as if afraid to meet anyone's eyes. By the time the riders reached the clearing, the sun had just begun to burn through the mist. The cabin stood quiet, smoke no longer rising from the chimney. The corral was empty, chickens scattered, their feed untouched. Even the dogs that normally barked at visitors were nowhere to be seen. The men dismounted slowly, exchanging uneasy glances. The air here was different, colder somehow, as though the clearing itself had been drained of warmth. One man crossed himself. They approached the cabin door. The latch was fastened. From the inside. They knocked. No answer. They knocked again, louder this time. The sound dull against the rough wood. Still nothing. Finally, a younger man fetched an axe from the woodpile. With one heavy swing, the door splintered inward. The smell that escaped was not of death, not yet, but of something stale, burned, and bitter, as though candles had been left to gutter for days. The men stepped inside. The sight that met them froze them where they stood. Around the table sat the entire Marrow family, hands folded neatly, backs straight, as though posed for a family portrait. Only their faces were twisted, mouths stretched wide in a scream no living throat was making. The men froze in the doorway, unable to move, unable even to breathe. The cabin was dim, lit only by a single guttered candle that had burned down to a blackened stub. Its smoke trailed lazily toward the rafters, leaving a bitter tang in the air. Dust motes floated through the pale shafts of morning light, leaking in through the cracks in the shutters. At the center of the room sat Elias Marrow, his face contorted into an expression no man present would ever forget. His jaw hung impossibly wide, lips cracked and drawn back, eyes bulging as if frozen in the very instant terror struck him. Beside him, Temperance sat stiffly upright, her long hair matted to her neck with sweat. The children were there too, Abigail and her two brothers, each one locked in the same ghastly silent scream. The table before them was set for supper, cold cornbread, a pot of beans turned to paste, milk souring in its jug. The plates were half-eaten, as if they had been taken mid-bite. One of the boys still clutched a wooden spoon in his rigid hand, his knuckles bone-white. And the cabin was wrecked. The walls bore deep scratches, as though someone, or something, had raked long nails across the wood in a frenzy. The door frame was splintered from the inside. A chair lay overturned near the hearth, one of its legs broken clean off. The Bible sat open in the center of the table, its pages curled and stained with wax. The passage was clear. Revelation 6. And there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. No one spoke for several minutes. The only sound was the faint creak of the house settling. One man finally whispered, "This wasn't murder." Another spat on the floor, shaking his head. "Then what in God's name was it?" But no one could answer. The sheriff stepped forward at last, his boots crunching on broken glass. He examined each body in turn, his jaw tight, his face unreadable. No wounds, no blood, just the terrible rictus of their faces and the stillness of the cabin. When he turned back to the others, his voice was low. "We'll bury them," he said. "But no one touches this house again." They nodded, though not one man looked away from those faces, as if expecting them to scream again at any second. The men stood in that room for what felt like hours, unwilling to step closer, unwilling to leave. It was as though time itself had stopped the moment the Marrow family had died, and no one dared disturb it. At last, the sheriff gestured to one of the younger men. "Close their eyes," he said quietly. The man stepped forward, but the moment his fingers brushed Elias Marrow's face, a shiver ran through him so hard he nearly dropped to his knees. The skin was cold. Not merely the cold of death, but a deeper chill, as though the flesh had been lying in snow. And yet the morning was warm, sunlight streaming through the gaps in the shutters. They did not close the eyes after all. Attention turned to the table. The food was strange, not just cold, but ruined. The beans were blackened and cracked, though no fire had burned the bone. The cornbread seemed brittle as if baked weeks ago, though neighbors swore the Marrows had been alive and well the day before. The milk was curdled and rank, carrying the sharp, acidic smell of rot. Someone bent to pick up the Bible, but the sheriff stopped him. "Leave it." His voice was firm. The passage stared up at them all the same, the words heavy in the air. And the moon became as blood. By the hearth they found the broken chair leg smeared with something dark, not blood, but something sticky and black, like pitch or tar. It gave off a faint odor, chemical and strange, like burned pine mixed with iron. The scratches on the walls grew more troubling the longer they looked at them. They were deep, far deeper than fingernails could have carved, running in desperate, frantic arcs across every surface, the walls, the door, even the floorboards beneath the table. And at the far corner of the room, one word had been carved again and again, gouged deep until splinters jutted like teeth. "Sing." The sheriff's face darkened. "We bury them tonight," he said, "and we seal this place." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group, except for one man, who shook his head, pale. "Seal it if you want," he whispered. "But I say burn it. Nothing good lives here now." They left the cabin as quietly as they had entered, leaving the door ajar behind them, as though afraid to trap whatever might still linger inside. To understand what happened in that cabin, the neighbors said, you had to look back at Elias Marrow's final weeks alive. Elias had always been a man of routine, rising before dawn, tending his fields, working until sunset, then reading scripture by the fire with his family. But sometime that summer, the rhythm broke. The first sign was the plough left standing in the field one morning, the soil half-turned. Elias had never left work undone in his life. The next week he stopped coming into town for supplies. When a neighbor passed by and offered to share seed, Elias only nodded once, eyes fixed on the tree line, as if listening to something far off. Soon after, the stories began. A boy from the next farm swore he heard someone singing from the woods near the Marrow property just after dark, a low, humming tune, strange and droning, with no words he could understand. He told his father, who came to warn Elias. Elias's response chilled him. "They're calling me," Elias said simply. His voice was calm, almost reverent, "and soon we will answer." That was the last time anyone saw him in town. Temperance Marrow, usually a warm and steady woman, began to look frail, as though she were carrying a heavy sickness. She came to market once, buying candles in bulk and salt by the pound, her hands trembling as she counted out the coins. She said little, only muttering that the nights were getting longer. Neighbors reported seeing strange fires on the Marrow property, small bonfires that burned until dawn. Some swore they heard voices chanting in unison, though no other visitors were ever seen. Then came the day Elias nailed his shutters closed, sealing the house from the outside world. For a week, no one saw or heard the family. Only the faint smell of smoke from the chimney proved they were still inside. A hunter passing through the woods claimed he saw Elias standing just beyond the fence line, staring into the trees with his head cocked, as if straining to catch a distant sound. When the hunter called out, Elias did not turn. He simply raised a hand and pressed one finger to his lips. That was 3 nights before the screaming began. When the sheriff returned to the house later that day to prepare the bodies for burial, he found something the others had missed. A small, leather-bound book hidden beneath the floorboards under Abigail Marrow's bed. It was her diary. The pages were soft with handling, the ink smeared in places as though written in haste. At first, the entries were ordinary. Notes about gathering berries, helping her mother churn butter, her frustration that one of her brothers kept stealing her comb. But as the weeks passed, the tone shifted. "Father does not sleep anymore," one entry read. "He walks at night. Sometimes I see him stand in the yard until the morning comes, staring at the woods. When I ask him what he sees, he says, 'You will hear it soon enough.'" A later page was worse. "I hear them now. Not only father. The sound is low, like bees in a hive, but it grows louder every night. I cannot tell if it comes from inside the house or outside. Mother prays, but her voice shakes. The boys cover their ears. I think father is glad." The sheriff turned the pages carefully, his thumb trembling. Abigail's handwriting grew more frantic toward the end, letters jagged and uneven as though scrawled by candlelight. "There was something at the window last night. I saw its shadow on the wall. It did not move like a person. It only stood there, and the humming got so loud I thought my head would burst. I wanted to scream, but father said to be still. He said if we stayed still, it would go away." The final entry was dated the very day before the family's death. "Tonight, father says we will sing with them. Mother is crying. I do not want to, but he says if we refuse, they will come inside and take us. He says we must keep singing until morning. I think he is not afraid anymore. I think he wants to go." The sheriff closed the book and slipped it into his coat. He did not tell the other men what it said. Not yet. But as he left the house, he thought he heard something faint behind him, coming from the empty bedroom. A thin, high voice, humming a tune that did not belong to any hymn he knew. Word of what was found at the Marrow cabin spread through Madison County like wildfire. By evening, nearly every household had gathered at the church, lanterns swinging from the rafters, faces drawn and pale. Some came out of duty, others out of morbid curiosity, but all wanted the same thing, an explanation. The preacher stood at the pulpit, Bible in hand, his voice trembling as he told them what the men had seen. He did not describe the contorted faces, nor the word carved into the walls. He simply said the family had gone to their judgment and that the Lord would have his justice in time. But the people wanted more. Old Widow Price stood and said she had heard the screaming herself. She swore it sounded like more than 5 voices, that it was a whole choir, men and women and children all wailing together. It was no sickness that did this, she said, her eyes flashing. It was witchwork. A farmer shook his head. Witchwork? In this place? More likely fever took them, or the devil's madness. I've seen it before. Makes a man tear his own house apart. Another man, a hunter, spoke up from the back. I seen lights in them woods night before last. Blue ones, flickering like lanterns, where no lantern should be. And I seen tracks too. Barefoot, but not like any foot I know. At that the room went quiet. Superstition ran deep in the valley. The elders still told stories of the creek burial grounds, not 5 miles east, where the dead were said to walk on certain nights. Most dismissed such tales, until now. The arguments swelled until the preacher slammed his Bible shut. Enough, he said. The Lord calls us to lay them to rest. They were good people, and they will be buried in consecrated ground. One of the men, the same who had urged burning the house, spoke up bitterly. Bury them if you want, he said, but that house ought to be ash before another night falls. Nothing good waits in there. No decision was made that night. The congregation left the church unsettled, glancing nervously toward the dark tree line on the way home. By morning, half the town swore they had heard the screaming again, softer this time, far away, as though the forest itself were reminding them that the Marrow family's story was not finished. Sheriff Calloway could not sleep. The image of the Marrows at that table stayed behind his eyelids every time he closed them. He saw Elias's bulging eyes, Abigail's frozen scream, the gouged word, sing in the wall. The preacher's words offered no comfort. There was something about that cabin that needed watching, something that needed understanding. So, just after midnight, he saddled his horse and rode alone toward the clearing. The road was narrow and dark, the forest crowding close on either side. He carried only a lantern and his revolver, though he doubted bullets would do much good against whatever haunted that place. When he reached the clearing, the mist was back, thicker than before, rolling low and white over the grass. The cabin stood like a blackened tooth against the pale moonlight, its door still hanging from the broken hinge. The moment he stepped inside, the air changed. It was colder here than outside, as though the cabin had been sealed in a block of ice. His breath fogged in the lantern light. The candle stub was gone, though he had left it there himself that morning. And then he saw the scratches. They were deeper now. Fresh curls of wood lay scattered across the floor as though something had been clawing at the walls while no one was inside. The word, sing, was still there, but beside it, in a hand so jagged it barely looked human, were new letters carved into the wood, join. The sheriff's skin crawled. A faint sound drifted through the cabin, so faint he first thought it was the wind. But there was no wind. It was a thin, hollow sobbing, coming from somewhere inside the walls themselves. He pressed his ear to the paneling, and the sound grew louder, not just crying now, but whispering, overlapping voices speaking words he could not understand. The lantern flame flickered. Then, from the corner of the room, came a sound that froze him in place, the creak of a chair sliding across the floor. But the chairs were all upright, untouched. Calloway backed toward the door, his lantern shaking in his hand. He did not run, not yet. But the moment he crossed the threshold, the whispering stopped. The night was silent again. He mounted his horse and rode hard back toward town, never once looking back. The Marrows were buried the following afternoon under a low grey sky. The preacher said the words, voice quivering, and the neighbours stood in silence as the coffins were lowered one by one into the churchyard. Elias was buried first, then Temperance, then the children together in a single wide plot. When the last shovel of earth was thrown, the sheriff noticed how the crowd lingered, heads bowed, as though listening for something beneath their feet. Only when the preacher said a final Amen did they drift away, leaving the fresh mounds behind them. For 3 nights, the valley was quiet. Then, just after midnight on the 4th night, the screaming returned. It was softer this time, distant, as though carried on the wind, but unmistakable. Those who lived closest to the churchyard said it came from beneath the ground itself. One woman, who lived across the road, swore she heard Elias Marrow's voice calling her name, long and drawn out. Another claimed she saw movement, as though the freshly turned earth were shifting, breathing, bulging upward from below. The next morning, a small group gathered at the churchyard. The soil over the children's grave had sunk in the night, leaving shallow depressions where their coffins lay. One man fetched a spade and jabbed it into the ground, and the moment he did, a sound like a low moan seemed to rise from the earth itself. The preacher fell to his knees, clutching his Bible. "Leave them be," he cried. "Whatever is happening, it is not for us to disturb." But fear is louder than faith. By evening a vote was taken. They would open the graves at dawn. Some argued it was blasphemy, others that it was the only way to be sure. The sheriff said nothing. He only polished his shovel and kept Abigail's diary close to him, rereading her final words. "Tonight we sing with them." That night no one in the valley slept. The cries came again, louder than before, accompanied by a dull, rhythmic pounding, as though something, or someone, was beating against the coffin lids from the inside. By morning, even the preacher agreed. The graves must be opened. The men gathered at first light, spades in hand, breath misting in the cool dawn air. None spoke as the digging began. What they unearthed would silence even the loudest skeptics, and convince the rest that something far darker than disease had come to Madison County. The morning was cold enough that frost clung to the grass around the churchyard, crunching under the men's boots as they gathered. No one spoke. Even the usual coughs and murmurs of dawn were absent, as though the valley itself were holding its breath. The first spade struck earth with a hollow sound. One by one they dug, the rhythm of shovels filling the air. The fresh soil came up dark and wet, releasing a sharp, sour smell that turned a few stomachs. Hours passed before the first coffin lid appeared, pale wood streaked with damp clay. The sheriff nodded, and 2 men pried the lid open. What they saw made one of them drop his crowbar. Elias Marrow lay not as they had placed him, but twisted sideways, hands clawed against the inside of the lid, fingernails broken and bloodied. His mouth was still open, but wider now, as though stretched further by some final, impossible scream. His eyes had rolled back white. "Dear God," someone whispered. One by one, they opened the other graves. Temperance was the same, body contorted, arms raised as though she had been pushing upward, trying to escape. The boys were worse, their small fingers raw from scratching at the wood, splinters driven under their nails. Abigail's coffin was the last to be opened. Her body was curled tightly in the coat, burner, as far from the lid as she could get. Her face turned toward the back of the coffin. Her lips were drawn into a faint, terrible smile. The preacher stepped back, crossing himself, tears streaming down his face. "This is not the work of fever," one of the men said, voice shaking. "They were alive when we buried them." The sheriff's jaw clenched. He looked down at the gouge marks inside the coffins, then back at the crowd. "Then what killed them after?" No one answered. The wind picked up, carrying a sound that made every man's blood run cold. A faint, distant humming from somewhere beyond the churchyard, as though the very trees were singing. "Cover them," the preacher said finally, voice hoarse. "And pray." But as the shovels began their work once more than one man swore he saw Elias's fingers twitch, just slightly, as the first handful of dirt struck his face. Dr. Nathaniel Harker arrived from Savannah 2 days later, summoned by the sheriff's urgent letter. He was a tall man with a grey beard and sharp, restless eyes that missed nothing. When he stepped down from his carriage and saw the churchyard, freshly filled again, his expression darkened. "They tell me you buried them twice," he said. The sheriff nodded grimly. "And they tell me they weren't dead the first time." Harker wasted no time. The graves were opened once more, this time under a sunless sky, as though nature itself refused to witness what would follow. The doctor crouched beside each coffin, his leather gloves stained with earth, his instruments laid out with precise care. He examined Elias first, pulling back the stiffened jaw and peering into the throat with a small mirrored tool. "No fluid in the lungs," he said finally. "No lesions, no swelling. This man did not die of consumption, nor fever." He moved on to Temperance, then the boys, and lastly Abigail. With each body his frown deepened. "These are not the bodies of the dead," he said at last, rising to his feet. "These are the bodies of the suffocated. Their hearts had been strong, their muscles fighting until the last. They were buried alive." A murmur rippled through the gathered townsfolk. "But how?" the sheriff asked quietly. "We watched them die. We saw the life leave their faces." Harker hesitated. Then something made them seem dead. Some force, natural or not. He pointed to the children's hands, where faint bruises ringed their wrists. "See here?" As though someone, or something, held them down before death. The preacher crossed himself, trembling. "You're saying they were murdered?" "I am saying," Harker replied, "that they were taken from this life by means I do not fully understand." Before the sheriff could respond, the wind shifted, and a strange smell rolled through the churchyard. Sweet, cloying, like honeysuckle but somehow rotting at the edges. The doctor turned his head sharply toward the trees. "Do you hear that?" he asked. At first there was nothing. Then faintly came the sound of a woman humming, low, mournful, yet somehow beckoning. It grew louder with each passing second, though no figure could be seen. Harker snapped his kit shut. "Get these graves filled. Tonight." No one argued. That night, no one slept. The sound began just after sunset, soft at first, as though someone were singing far away across the hills. It was a woman's voice, low and wordless, weaving a slow, mournful melody. The tune had no clear beginning or end. It seemed to rise out of the earth itself. By midnight, the whole valley could hear it. Children cried, dogs howled. Lanterns glowed in every farmhouse window as neighbors stepped out onto their porches, looking toward the churchyard as though drawn by some invisible hand. Sheriff Calloway stood outside the jailhouse, rifle in hand, watching the black silhouette of the trees sway against the starless sky. The sound was clearer now, almost inside his skull, or not heard with the ears, but felt in the bones. Dr. Harker joined him, pale-faced, coat collar pulled tight. "It's not natural," he said simply. "Voices carry, yes, but not like this. The air is too still." And then the sound changed. The single voice became many, first 2, then 3, then a dozen, until it seemed the woods themselves were filled with women singing, each voice slightly out of time with the next, building a strange, discordant harmony. Some swore they could make out words now, though no one could agree on what was being said. One farmer insisted he heard his own dead mother's name whispered in the spaces between the notes. Another said the voices were calling the townsfolk by name, one by one. The sheriff tried to rally a group of men to search the forest, but none would go. Even the bravest said their feet felt nailed to the ground, their limbs heavy as stone. And then came the movement. At the edge of the clearing near the churchyard, shapes began to appear. Faint and pale, like figures cut from mist. They stood silently, half hidden among the trees, as though listening to the song. The preacher dropped to his knees, praying aloud, his words lost under the rising hum. When the singing finally ceased, just before dawn, the silence that followed was somehow worse. The figures were gone, the woods empty once more. But on the church door, carved deep into the wood, was a single word that had not been there the night before. Join. The sheriff touched it with the tip of his finger. The wood was still warm. By sunrise, the town was awake and gathered in the square. No one had to be called. They came on their own, pale and hollow-eyed, driven by the same unspoken terror. The preacher stood on the steps of the meeting hall, clutching his Bible so hard his knuckles blanched white. "We cannot stay," he said, voice trembling. "The valley is cursed." "What? Tiva this is. It will not stop until it has taken all of us." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, already prepared to leave their farms, their land, their dead. Others shouted him down, unwilling to abandon the only home they had ever known. Sheriff Calloway stepped forward, weary but unshaken. "Running won't save us," he said. "If this thing follows us, if it is in us, it won't matter how far we go." His words silenced them. Dr. Harker cleared his throat, speaking for the first time. "I have seen plague, gentlemen. I have seen the dead rise with fever, and madness take whole families. This is neither. Whatever it is, it has purpose. It wants something." At this, an old farmer spoke. His voice was hoarse, his hands shaking. "It wants us to join them." The words landed like a blow. A woman sobbed and clutched her child to her chest. Someone else spat on the ground, muttering that they should burn the Marrow cabin and the churchyard both. The sheriff agreed to meet that evening to decide, fight or flight, stay or flee. But already he could feel the crowd splintering, factions forming. Fear had become a second language here, passed from man to man, like a contagion. That night, as the town argued, the singing came again, but louder, closer, circling the very edges of the square. The sound filled every crack and corner of the meeting hall, pressing against the windows, vibrating through the floorboards. And then, as if in answer to their debate, the church bell began to ring. No one had touched the rope. The bell swung wildly on its own, each toll so loud it rattled the glass in the windows. The sound drove several from the hall, screaming into the night. When the bell finally stopped, the sheriff swore he saw a figure standing beneath it, Abigail Marrow, hair hanging wet, her head tilted as though listening. When he blinked, she was gone. At dawn, the decision was made. The Marrow cabin would burn. Men gathered with torches and kerosene, their faces grim, their hands steady with a resolve born of fear. The preacher stood apart, lips moving silently in prayer. Sheriff Calloway led the procession through the misty woods, the sound of boots and wagon wheels crunching the earth the only noise. When they reached the clearing, the cabin stood waiting, black and silent, its windows like staring eyes. No one spoke as they doused the walls, the roof, the very threshold with kerosene. The sheriff waited until the last man had stepped back before striking a match. The flame caught instantly. Within moments, fire roared up the walls, racing along the beams, devouring the roof. The smoke was thick and oily, choking the clearing, but none of the men moved. They stood in a wide circle, watching in silence as the house that had held so much terror was consumed. Then came the sound. It began low, almost inaudible beneath the crackling of the flames, a faint humming, like a woman's voice. Then it grew, rising with the fire, until the very walls seemed to scream. The sheriff swore he saw shapes writhing in the smoke, pale faces pressed against the windows, though the glass had already melted away. The fire took on a strange rhythm, flaring and dimming like a living thing, as though the cabin itself were breathing its last. When the roof finally collapsed, sending a shower of sparks into the grey sky, the humming stopped. The men stood still for a long moment. Then, one by one, they turned and left, leaving the ruins smouldering in the clearing. But that night, the singing returned, louder than ever. The sound rolled through the valley like a tide, and this time it carried words, terrible and clear. You cannot leave. Every window in Madison County shook. The church bell rang again, not once, but 3 times. When the sheriff rode out to the clearing the next morning, his heart froze. The cabin was standing again. The charred remains were gone, the walls were whole, the roof broken, as though the fire had never touched it. The only sign of what had happened was the scorched grass around the foundation and, carved deep into the front door, fresh and blackened as if by fire, was a new word: stay. By the second night after the cabin's impossible return, panic had become something worse: grim acceptance. The townsfolk gathered in the woods, away from the churchyard, away from the cabin, away from the eyes of anything that might be watching. It was Sheriff Calloway who called the meeting, though he did not relish it. They gathered in a rough circle, torches casting long, jagged shadows across the trees. The air smelled of damp moss and fear. "This isn't a sickness," Calloway said quietly. "It isn't a haunting we can wait out. It wants something from us." Dr. Harker nodded. Something, or someone. At that, the preacher stepped forward. His face looked as though it had aged years in mere days. "There are stories," he said slowly. "Old stories, told by the first settlers. They spoke of something in these hills long before the church was built. Something that took when it was not given. They said it was why the valley was so fertile. Because it was fed." The crowd shifted uneasily. "Fed?" one man asked. The preacher's eyes lowered. "With blood." For a long time no one spoke. Then an old woman at the back of the group whispered, "Then maybe it's time we feed it." The sheriff's stomach turned, but the murmurs spread. One by one, heads began to nod. They spoke of sacrifices, of giving the valley what it seemed to demand, an offering to stop the voices, to let them sleep again. "What are you saying?" the sheriff demanded. "We choose," said the old woman. "Better to give one than lose all." The argument went long into the night. Some wept openly. Others spoke with cold, steady voices, as though this had always been inevitable. By the time the torches were guttering low, a decision had been made. They would choose one. One soul to be given to the cabin, buried at its threshold before sunrise. The preacher refused to bless the act, but he did not stop it either. His silence was as loud as any prayer. As they dispersed, each person walked quickly, heads down, refusing to look at one another. But the sheriff stayed behind, staring into the trees. Somewhere, faint and sweet, the humming had begun again, softer now, almost pleased. And though he could not see her, he knew Abigail Marrow was standing just beyond the torchlight, waiting. By dawn, the town had chosen. They gathered again in silence, this time in the square, faces pale, eyes hollow. No one dared speak the name until the sheriff himself demanded it. "Who?" It was the old woman who had first suggested the offering who stepped forward, her voice steady. "Thomas Reddick." A murmur passed through the crowd. Reddick was a farmhand, unmarried, a man with no children and no kin left in the valley. Some nodded grimly as though this made sense. Others turned away ashamed. "Why him?" the sheriff asked. "Because he's a drunk and a brawler," one man said sharply. "Because he has done little good for this town and much harm." "It isn't about justice," Calloway replied, his voice hard. "If we do this, it must be because it will stop what's happening, not because he is easy to lose." But no one answered. By mid-morning, Reddick was found half asleep in the hayloft behind the mill. They dragged him into the square, and when he saw the gathered crowd, he began to laugh. "You're all mad," he spat. "Mad as the Marrows. Burn me if you want, it won't save you." His laughter didn't last long. By evening, Reddick was bound, gagged, and carried through the woods by torchlight. His struggles were weak, his curses muffled, but his eyes never stopped glaring, wild, furious, and strangely fearless. The clearing was quiet when they arrived. The cabin loomed before them, dark but whole, its windows glinting in the firelight. The preacher refused to come closer than the tree line. "Do what you must," he said hoarsely, "but know that I will not bless this." The sheriff felt something twist in his chest. Every step toward the cabin felt heavier, as though the earth itself resisted him. They dug a shallow pit at the threshold and lowered Reddick into it. The man thrashed and kicked until someone struck him across the temple, leaving him limp. The sheriff hesitated with the first shovelful of earth. He thought he heard voices, soft, eager, whispering from inside the cabin. When the last of the dirt was thrown and tamped flat, the humming began again. This time, it was not mournful. It was almost joyous. The firelight flared. The cabin seemed to breathe, and then, from deep within the ground, came the sound of Reddick screaming. The next morning, the valley was silent. For the first time in weeks, there was no humming, no singing, no sound of phantom bells. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as though a storm had passed. Some dared to smile, others wept with relief. "It worked," someone whispered, but Sheriff Calloway could not share their relief. He stood at the edge of the clearing long after the others had gone, staring at the freshly packed earth where Thomas Reddick lay buried. The ground was smooth, undisturbed, but he thought he felt a faint vibration under his boots, like the heartbeat of something alive beneath the soil. By afternoon, life began to resume its fragile rhythm. The mill opened. Children played in the square. The preacher held a short service, thanking God for deliverance, though his voice cracked more than once as he spoke. That night, there was still no singing, and then came the second night. Calloway woke just before dawn to the sound of whispering outside his window. At first he thought it was wind in the grass, but then he heard his own name, hissed softly, over and over. When he stepped outside, the yard was empty. The next morning, a farmer found something carved into the bark of a tree near the churchyard. More. The letters were deep, blackened, as though burned into the wood. By midday, the cattle had begun to bellow, restless and panicked. Chickens refused to leave their coops. At sunset, the first child went missing, a boy of 7, last seen playing near the creek. His footprints led halfway into the woods and then stopped. The town gathered once more, their brief relief gone, replaced by raw fear. "It wasn't enough," Dr. Harker said grimly. "It has taken the boy as well." The sheriff clenched his fists. "Then we fed it for nothing." "No," the preacher said quietly, staring toward the hills. "You fed it once, and now it is hungry." That night, the singing returned, louder, fuller, as though the entire valley were alive with voices. The sound was no longer mournful, but triumphant, a chorus of many throats raised in eerie, wordless harmony, and beneath the singing came a sound worse still, a slow, rhythmic pounding, like fists against coffin lids. It came from the ground. The pounding did not stop. All through the night, it echoed underfoot, a hollow, dreadful rhythm that seemed to move through the very soil of Madison County. People lay awake in their beds, gripping each other's hands, feeling it vibrate through the floorboards like distant thunder. By dawn, the churchyard was crowded. No one had to be summoned. They came as though drawn by an unseen force. The graves of the Marrow family had changed overnight. The soil over each mound was cracked and sunken, as though something had been pushing upward from below. The sheriff stepped forward, jaw set. "We dig," he said simply. The men set to work, shovels biting into the earth. The first coffin they reached was Elias's. Its lid had split down the middle, jagged wood pried apart from within. Inside, there was nothing. The others were the same. Temperance, the boys, even Abin, Igail. Every coffin was empty. A low moan ran through the crowd. Some crossed themselves, others turned to run, but the sheriff's voice stopped them cold. "Look," he said. Beyond the churchyard, along the tree line, stood 5 figures. They were pale as chalk, their clothes filthy and torn, their limbs stiff but unmistakably alive. Elias Marrow stood at their head, his mouth open wide, his throat working as though singing, though no sound came. One by one, the townsfolk fell silent. The only noise was the strange high ringing in the air, like glass vibrating. Then, all at once, the Marrows moved, not fast, but forward, in unison, their bare feet leaving no sound on the grass. With each step they took, the ringing grew louder, until it was almost unbearable. When they reached the churchyard gate, they stopped. Abigail stepped forward, her head tilted, her eyes black as coal. Slowly, she raised one hand and pointed toward the square. Then she spoke, her voice as cold as the grave. "Join." The word hung in the air like smoke. Before anyone could move, the Marrows turned and vanished into the woods, dissolving into the mist like wraiths. When the last trace of them was gone, the sheriff found himself gripping the handle of his revolver, though he knew it would do no good. "They aren't resting," he said, more to himself than to the crowd. "They're gathering." Sheriff Calloway saddled his horse before dawn, alone. He told no one where he was going, though Dr. Harker suspected, and the preacher's silent stare seemed to follow him down the road. The valley was still as he rode, a pale mist curling low over the fields. The trees loomed black ahead of him, the same trees where the Marrows had vanished the night before. He rode slowly at first, then faster, letting the horse carry him into the woods until the town disappeared behind him. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. Even the birds had gone silent, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. The air grew damp and heavy, and with each step of the horse's hooves, the earth seed made softer, as though it had been disturbed recently. He dismounted when he reached the clearing near the old Marrow homestead. The cabin stood exactly as before, whole, unburned, its door shut tight. But there were footprints all around it, bare footprints. Some small as a child's, others larger, pressed deep into the mud, circling the cabin as though dozens had gathered there in the night. Calloway tied his horse to a post and drew his revolver. He approached the door slowly, listening. At first there was nothing. Then came the sound, faint, distant singing, the same strange melody that had haunted them for weeks. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. He kicked the door open. The cabin was empty, but the floor was different now. A wide circular hole gaped in the center of the room, stairs carved roughly into the earth, spiraling downward into darkness. Cold air rose from it, carrying that same sickly sweet smell of rotten flowers. Calloway stood at the threshold of the pit, lantern raised. Somewhere below, the singing stopped, and then came a sound that froze him where he stood. A single, hollow knock, as though someone had struck the underside of the earth. He took one step down, then another. And as the darkness swallowed him, he thought he heard voices. Not just the Marrows now, but others, dozens, maybe hundreds, whispering in unison. His lantern flickered. When it went out, the sheriff did not scream, but the horse outside reared and bolted, as though something unseen had just stepped out of the cabin behind it. When the sun rose the next morning, Sheriff Calloway's horse was found wandering the road back into town, riderless, foam-dried along its flanks. By noon, word had spread. The sheriff was gone. Dr. Harker organized a search party, though few volunteered. The men who did go rode with eyes darting toward the woods, hands white-knuckled around, their rifles. They found Calloway's trail easily, hoof prints leading straight toward the clearing where the Marrow cabin stood. But when they reached it, the cabin was empty, silent, as though holding its breath. Inside, the floorboards were slick with damp earth. In the center of the room was a single boot print, Calloway's, leading toward a hole that now stood wide open, gaping like a throat. But there were no prints coming back out. The men did not linger. They covered the hole with boards and nailed them fast, then left as quickly as they could, refusing to speak on the ride home. That night, the singing came again. But this time, there was something different. It was deeper now, louder, with a cadence almost like speech. And somewhere in the harmony, one voice stood out. A man's voice, low and steady, calling the townsfolk by name. Samuel Green. Margaret Finch. One by one, every name was spoken, until there was no soul in Madison County left uncalled. When they dared return to the cabin the next day, the boards had been torn away, not broken, but neatly stacked beside the doorway. And on the wall inside, gouged deep into the wood, was a new word: welcome. Dr. Harker stared at it for a long time, his face pale, his jaw set. "It has him," he said finally, "and it means to have the rest of us." The preacher dropped to his knees, begging the town to flee, to leave everything behind and never return. But already, some were whispering that perhaps Calloway had not been taken against his will, that perhaps he had chosen to stay. That night, lanterns burned in every house, but no one slept. Near midnight, several witnesses swore they saw the sheriff walking through the square, lantern in hand, coat dusty, eyes blank as river stones. When they called his name, he turned his head slowly and smiled. At dawn, they found him standing outside the courthouse. Sheriff Calloway's hat was gone, his coat soaked through with mud. His boots were caked with black earth, and there was something smeared across his hands that looked too dark to be dirt. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. When the first brave soul, Mrs. Finch, stepped forward and asked if he was hurt, he simply tilted his head, like a dog listening to a distant sound, and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind that made the air feel colder. Dr. Harker approached him slowly, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "Calloway," he said carefully, "where did you go?" The sheriff's lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, just as Harker turned to glance at the others, Calloway spoke, though the voice that came out was not entirely his own. "They're waiting," he said, "and you've been called." He walked past them then, through the square, and every dog in town began to howl. Some of the townsfolk backed away, whispering prayers. Others followed him, compelled by something they couldn't name. He made his way to the churchyard, where the graves of the Marrows still lay open. Without hesitation, Calloway stepped into the largest of the pits and stood there as though claiming it for his own. "We've tried to stop them," he said, his voice stronger now, but eerily calm. "We burned the cabin, we buried the dead, we prayed, and yet they rise." His eyes swept the crowd, fixing on each person as though weighing them. "They do not want our prayers," he said. "They want us." Then he knelt down and pressed his hand to the earth. The ground trembled. Some ran, others screamed, but no one approached him, not even Harker. When Calloway finally stood, the soil beneath him had turned black and wet, as though soaked in pitch. His boots left prints that steamed in the morning air. He walked back toward town without another word, leaving the hole yawning behind him. That night, the singing stopped, but in its place came a new sound, the slow, steady rhythm of boots walking the streets long after midnight. And in very house, every single person in Madison County dreamed the same dream of standing in the clearing, of hearing their own name called, and of walking toward the voice. It began just after midnight. At first it was only a whisper on the wind, faint, almost kind, like the sound of someone humming a lullaby far away. Then it grew louder, clearer, until every soul in Madison County heard it, as though it were being spoken directly into their ear. Their names. One by one, called in a slow, deliberate cadence, the voices rose like a litany. Some tried to cover their ears, others locked their doors, pressed furniture against them. But it made no difference. The sound was not coming from outside. It was inside their homes, inside their skulls. Margaret Finch was the first to leave her house. Neighbors saw her step into the street barefoot, nightgown trailing in the dirt, her eyes open but unseeing. Behind her, her husband followed, then their children, each falling into step as though sleepwalking. House by house, door by door, the same thing happened. By the time the church bell struck 1, The entire town was on the move. Dozens of figures walking silently, forming a long line that wound down the road toward the Marrow clearing. Dr. Harker tried to stop them. He grabbed Samuel Green by the shoulders, shouting into his face. But Green didn't even blink. "They're gone," Harker whispered to no one, before falling in line himself. At the front of the procession walked Sheriff Calloway, lantern raised, leading them like a funeral cortege. The night was unnaturally still. No crickets, no owls, only the crunch of feet on gravel, and the soft chorus of names being whispered again and again until the words seemed to lose all meaning. When they reached the clearing, the cabin was no longer just a cabin. The earth around it had opened, revealing a vast, yawning pit that pulsed with faint reddish light. The singing, if it could still be called that, echoed up from its depths, joined by dozens of other voices, weaving together into something that sounded almost like joy. Without hesitation, the first of the townsfolk stepped forward and began descending the earthen steps into the glow. One by one, they followed, as if compelled by something greater than fear, greater than reason. At the very edge of the clearing, the preacher stood trembling, Bible clutched to his chest. "Lord, forgive us," he whispered. And then he too walked forward. The pit swallowed them whole. The air grew warmer the deeper they went, thick with the smell of damp clay and something sweeter, like lilies rotting in the sun. The glow ahead pulsed slowly, like the beating of a heart, casting long shadows across the dirt walls. No one spoke. Even the children moved silently, stepping carefully down the spiral path. Some wept without sound, tears streaking their faces, but their feet never stopped. At the front, Sheriff Calloway's lantern flickered, though it was no longer the brightest light. The glow ahead had taken on a reddish-gold hue, illuminating a chamber that seemed impossibly large, as though they were descending not into a cellar, but into the hollow belly of the earth itself. When the last of them reached the bottom, the singing stopped. The silence was absolute. Then, from the darkness, figures stepped forward. The Marrows. They were no longer pale, no longer stiff. Their skin shone with a faint sheen of moisture, their eyes glimmering like wet stones. Elias stood at their head, his shirt torn open, chest marked with black symbols that writhed faintly as though alive. He raised a hand, and Calloway knelt. The sheriff's voice, when it came, was soft but carried through the chamber. "They are ready," he said. Elias smiled. From the earthen walls, more shapes emerged. Not just the Marrows, but dozens more, faces unfamiliar yet dressed in clothes from decades past. Some were soldiers in faded confet, dirate coats, others women in tattered bonnets, children with hair matted to their skulls. Madison County had not been the first. The preacher clutched his Bible until his knuckles turned white. "What is this?" he asked, his voice cracking. Elias stepped closer, his bare feet leaving no sound in the red soil. "This is the covenant," he said. "You buried us, but you did not bury what we serve." Behind him the chamber seemed to pulse again, as though something deeper still, something unseen, had stirred at his words. The townsfolk stood frozen, as though caught between terror and trance. And then Abigail laughed, a sound like glass shattering. "They're listening," she whispered, "and they are pleased." The ground trembled once, hard enough to knock dust from the ceiling. Whatever waited in the earth was awake now, and it was hungry. The chamber shook again, a deep, resonant thud like the beating of a colossal drum. Dust drifted from above, settling in their hair and clothes. Elias raised his arms as though in benediction, and the crowd parted without being told. "It has always been this way," he said. His voice was calm, almost gentle, though it carried a weight that made every heart sink. "The land must be fed. The living must join the dead, or the dead will walk until there is no living left." Behind him, the unseen thing in the earth gave a low, shuddering groan, neither fully sound nor vibration, but something that seemed to move through bone and blood. The preacher fell to his knees. "God help us," he whispered. Elias's gaze slid to him. God does not come here, he said softly. Then the choosing began. It happened silently. Elias would simply raise his hand, and a person would step forward as though chosen by something far beyond human will. Margaret Finch was first. She walked to the center of the chamber, hands folded, tears streaming down her face but no sound leaving her lips. One by one, others followed. Samuel Green, the butcher's eldest son, too, 3 of the Cobb children. Each knelt before Elias, and as they did, the glow in the chamber deepened, turning the soil almost crimson. Sheriff Calloway stood among them, expression blank, waiting like the rest. When Elias pointed to him, Calloway did not hesitate. He stepped forward and knelt, laying his revolver at Elias's feet like an offering. But when Elias's hand turned toward Dr. Harker, something changed. Harker did not move. No, he said, his voice hoarse but steady. For the first time, Elias frowned. The chamber went silent. You would refuse? He asked, almost incredulous. Harker's hand tightened on the lantern he carried. If this is to be the end of us, I will not go meekly into your grave. The walls groaned, the ground trembling hard enough to nearly throw them from their feet. From somewhere in the darkness came a chorus of whispers, rising and falling like wind through a graveyard. Elias's smile returned, cruel this time. Then you will go screaming. He raised both hands, and the earth split open beneath their feet. The ground gave way with a roar like thunder, and the chamber fell into chaos. Townsfolk screamed as the soil split beneath their feet, sending some tumbling into the unseen depths below. The glow surged brighter, staining their faces red as though they stood before a furnace. Dr. Harker clutched the lantern, swinging it wildly. Its flame caught the damp walls, lighting carvings no one had seen before. Symbols etched into the very clay, twisting and alive, pulsing with the rhythm of a heartbeat. This is not a grave, he cried. It's a mouth. The preacher dropped his Bible as a column of earth split beside him, and from within it a pale arm reached out, a thing neither living nor dead, clutching at his robes with claw-like fingers. His scream was swallowed by the chamber as he was pulled down into the soil. Elias Marrow's voice rose above the din, not shouting but commanding. Join! The chosen obeyed, stepping calmly into the fissures opening all around, vanishing into the black. They went with serenity, as though into the arms of family, while others clawed at the walls, shrieking, desperate to escape. Dr. Harker tried to lead the latter toward the spiral steps, but the way up was already closing, the soil folding in on itself like a closing fist. Sheriff Calloway stood still in the center of the chamber, his eyes reflecting the crimson glow. His lips moved silently, repeating the same word again and again. Welcome. When the last light of Harker's lantern guttered, the chamber plunged into a darkness so absolute that sound itself seemed muffled. The only thing that remained was the vibration, slow, steady, rising in tempo, as though something vast had finished stirring and was now fully awake. The earth swallowed their screams. By dawn, Madison County was silent. The streets were empty, the doors ajar, meals left unfinished on tables. Not a soul remained. Travelers who came weeks later found the town deserted, the fields untended, the church bells swaying though no wind blew. The graves in the churchyard were open still, black soil damp as though freshly turned. And some nights, only some, a faint sound could be heard from the valley. A low, unbroken chorus, neither joy nor sorrow, but something older, something hungrier. A song of names. If you lived in that town, would you have stayed or run?